Um, Great, recording. So welcome everyone to Arts Lunch, a special Arts Lunch for May 4th, the Star Wars day of the calendar, that sacred part of progressive religious culture, I guess. I don't know if that's true. We'll find out today if this is maybe a holiday that we'll observe at United. But I'm so glad that you're all here to welcome Dr. Robyn Walsh, Star Wars and religion extraordinaire, unofficial expert. You probably, I don't know if you agree with that, but
I don't, but that's okay. I don't want to undermine myself before we even begin. So
exactly.
I'll just nod.
At least unofficial expert on asking the question if Star Wars is a religion.
Fair.
So I'll ask you a little bit to say more about your background, but I'll just say that I've known Dr. Walsh, or as I call her, Robyn.
Please call me Robyn. I want this to be comfortable. It's lunch. So yeah, Robyn is fine.
Like
yeah, no Dr. Walsh, throw that out.
I was a tiny child.
I've known you since the late 90s.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah. So there might be extra informal moments. But I'm so excited to welcome you here. And yeah, before we go into the question, would you mind saying a little bit about where you are right now, and what you've been doing recently?
As far as Star Wars is concerned, yes. So I ended up writing a piece a few years ago on Huffington Post about the question, is Star Wars a religion? And the genesis of that was really pedagogical, because I study the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean world, and my specialty is in early Christianity. And especially because that's a religion that's still practiced and gods that are still observed, and many of my students themselves observe those practices and that God, or depending on how you conceptualize those deities, the deities invested within Christian circles, it's often hard for them to avoid anachronism, or to think about the question of when does a religion become a religion? And for early Christianity, that's an interesting question, because Jesus, his followers, Paul, everyone in the orbit of our evidence for the earliest, or the earliest evidence for Christianity, so the 1st century CE, all those people are Jewish. And so there's this big question of, well, when does Christianity become something other than a Jewish movement? So this is one of the primary questions that we have when we talk about early Christianity. And because I'm primarily concerned with early Christianity as a Roman religion, so a religion that emerges under the auspices of the Roman Empire of the 1st century, this becomes a little bit thorny and theoretically difficult, especially if one is not accustomed to challenging their own views, again, if they are coming from that faith background, but also just a difficult question in any academic circle to answer, especially without anachronism. And so I find it's helpful pedagogically to shift the frame somewhat. And so I like to draw on students' pre-knowledge often, and a pre-knowledge that's a little bit more neutral. And Star Wars is a very useful example for several reasons. One is that, unlike something like Lord of the Rings, if I want to make reference to another pop culture intersection between film that has some Christian elements to it, that might be a useful model. Those movies are getting increasingly, or the movie Gladiator. I used to love to use Gladiator to talk about the ancient Mediterranean, and that's becoming even, more in the distant. There's all kinds of fog, that's emerging. Fewer and fewer students have seen it as the years go on. But Star Wars is perennial. It just continues to perpetuate the original movies. Then, because of the prequels, it was still relevant. I mean, the prequels came out when I was in college, so when I first met Max. And then we've had more recently the subsequent movie trilogy. And then, gift of all gifts, Baby Yoda. Is it Grogu? Okay, I'm seeing nodding. I Baby Yoda. So thank goodness we had, these other, so the franchise continues to perpetuate itself. So it is pedagogically useful for that reason. And I usually have enough students who are exposed to it in one way or the other. The other thing is that there are people who claim they are Jedi. There is a Church of the Jedi, and the impetus for the Huffington Post piece was a census that took place, I think it was around 2001. The date is a little bit, it doesn't quite matter for the point I'm making here, but especially in New Zealand, there are more people claiming that they are, thank you, Max just linked to the piece. There are more people claiming that they are Jedi than claiming they are Buddhist or Hindu or a number of other religious traditions. And so it became an interesting point of contact to think about these issues, to explore the theoretical question, one is a religion, because in this case, you have a story about some central figures who face some epic challenges, and there's supernatural elements like the Force, and continuing developing stories of other characters around this central theme. And there are spin-offs on this and multiple versions of the same story, and contestation between people on which the authorized story, what is the canon? Are the prequels canon? Is it just the original trilogy? How do we fuse in some of these other elements into that central story? How do we understand the Force? What happens when the creator makes some changes in the theology by making statements about their intentions or not, thinking about just and Lucasfilm's involvement in all of this, right? So there's issues of theology, issues of supernatural beings. There are issues of even commerce and how, is it a money-making thing? And if someone's doing it for certain kinds of social capital, if they're making a product that's related to that central narrative for social capital, what does that mean? Everything there has some relevance for thinking about other issues within religious studies, to my mind. And also gives students an interesting touchstone to contact the Church of the Jedi and ask them, how does this work? Because it seems as though the Church of the Jedi, from the research that my students have brought to me and that I've looked into, it's almost like an add-on to what other religion you might be. You can just kind of add on that you're a Jedi to another religious tradition. So that's interesting, the hybridity of that. And so there's a lot to think about in terms of, well, is there a religion happening in front of our eye? Are we in the water right now? Back the frog analogy everyone likes to make. Is there a Jedi religion starting to emerge in our own era that, looking back 2,000 years from now, people will try to figure out the canon, the original story? Even with the Gospels, it's a nice analogy because the later stories came first and then there were prequels. So there's so many touchstones that I can make pedagogically. That's how it began. And then sorry for the long-winded answer, but then I actually did turn it into a course. So it used to be an exercise in class to think about the ancient world. And then I turned it into a course that's essentially a theory and method course in religion. So the title of the course is Star Wars, a Religion. And I taught it in a mode that's called Harkness, which is the students learn via discussion. I'm actually not even supposed to talk. That never happens. If you know me, that never happens. So I try to be as patient as I can, but the students are given a problem, whether it's in the form of a question or just a reading that they go through together, and they work together via discussion to work out whatever issue is relevant for the day's discussion around a round table. And so the question, is Star Wars a religion, was perfect for thinking about theory and method, because I could assign something about Star Wars and I would sit there with the computer with the multimedia, and if something came up, this is in the before days, if something came up from the movie, I can call it up on the screen and we could discuss it. So I set up weeks, issues of canon, issues of practice, issues. So you can go across the gamut, and so that's where it's come from.
So you offered this class right as COVID hit, and you adapted it.
I did.
Would you mind talking a little bit about that? Because you did, it was pretty interesting, and you got a lot of people into your class, different experts.
I did. So yeah, in the same spirit of Harkness, because I was in the middle of the semester when COVID hit. And because Harkness, the methodology pedagogically is about learning via discussion, I could no longer really effectively, especially as we were not yet accustomed to Zoom with how rapidly things shifted. The idea of having the students teach one another via discussion seemed to me to be clunky. And I worried about issues of equity in that situation. You know, students who didn't have at that point, and still some don't, access to adequate broadband, access to adequate technology outside of the classroom to participate equally. And so I thought, well, if the class is about learning via discussion, who's to say that I can't discuss these things with other experts and then have the students listen and participate? It was almost like I deconstructed the conversation. So in an age when everyone has a podcast, I decided I would create a podcast for that class on Star Wars. And so I solicited, Max came to speak to the class about performance and religion and Star Wars. I spoke to Dr. Mark Lucher, who's a former filmmaker and musician, about issues with just the movie making aspects. I spoke to another scholar named Brent Landau, who works on the question of canon and early Christianity. And the Secret Gospel of Mark was a project he was working on at the time, and he came in to talk about canon. I talked to Dr. Jen Isle and Dr. Aaron Roberts about the concept of the word we translate as spirit in the New Testament. In Greek, it's called pneuma or pneuma. And in Stoic thought, it's an all-pervasive energy or force that binds the universe together and is a means for God to communicate with all living things in different tensions, and it mixes with human bodies in different tensions that gives power, like the power to heal or to resurrect or to become God's son. So the concept of pneuma, the Stoic concept, became very handy for me to think about the force. The force is a very handy analogy when I'm talking about Stoicism in the first century. And so I brought Dr. Roberts and Dr. Isle in to talk about Stoic concepts of pneuma and how it might relate to the concept of the force. So those are just a few examples. I brought in my husband, Dr. Jaswinder Bellina, who's a poet and an essayist who also happens to love Star Wars, but to also talk about narrative structure. So I was able to fashion the rest of the class in that way, where I would have these extended conversations with these experts about Star Wars, but more than even just religion. Of course, religion was a factor, but it became very interdisciplinary so that we could talk about multiple facets, and then the students could send in questions that I would then pose. So it was almost like a tutorial with all of these experts. So they were able to have a conversation. It was just, again, deconstructed.
So you've mentioned some of the themes that came up with this course, with the podcast, and I'm wondering if you would mind going into more depth, maybe with the question of canon, for instance. I think almost every person on the podcast brought up canon, and if they didn't, you probably did.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it would be fun to talk about that today too, because there were different ways that we came about that. Now, of course, this is a subject for which many people are very passionate. And so it came out, nobody could quite help themselves but to reveal what they thought canon was when it comes to Star Wars. Is it the novels that were produced? You know, was it the such and such a screenplay that was rejected, or like, you know, this fan fiction that lots of people love that they tried to incorporate into later editions, and that all of that came out. What that to me became was even more than a question of canon, because that appears to be rather subjective. It still appears to be subjective. But the question of origins became, I think, very important in that conversation. One thing for me, and I know that I'm making a derivative statement, so I'm sorry, Max, we can come back. But something that stuck with me that I think also my Dr. Bellina brought up in our conversation was genre. And so how does genre intersect with canon? Because essentially what you had with Star Wars was a spaghetti Western in space. And it fused also, I mean, at a time when the space program, obviously, and, you know, it was a big deal, you know, in that generation. It fused a lot of genres of both filmmaking, narrative, and storytelling at that moment, which for me is also really interesting, because of what I do in the first century, trying to figure out, the Gospels and Paul and all these other issues, right? How the New Testament comes together. And so the reason genre is interesting to me in terms of canon, because the issue and origin, the concept of origin, is because canon really is a manifestation of later debate. So we're debating in our generation the issue of canon, I think, a lot more, with the exception of maybe when the prequels came out, because there are some people who love the prequels and consider them, right? So that, I feel like the issue of canon is still so flexible. We should talk about that today. But it did raise these issues of origin and genre, I think, and to think about what is really the genesis of some of these discourses.
And I think so. Canon and that discussion is really also about what the stories are that are being told, and doesn't always necessarily get at that other question of the participation of audiences. And so when there's the question of how is Star Wars a religion, there's Star Wars within like the stories, and then there's also the participation and community. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about sort of fandom and the role of the participant
in reception history. Is that what you're
a little bit of
thinking?
That too.
A little bit. Well, the interesting thing about it is the different strata that are involved in this, because there is sort of the expert class who will argue, well, I'm a filmmaker, so therefore I can tell you, this is completely Jar Jar Binks, right? So not to get too in the weeds, but you hear that kind of that level of analysis at where was social capital conferred for certain decision making, and so therefore in the reception history of other experts, other filmmakers, those who study narrative structure, here's their opinion on what should be included and excluded. And that can come down to the micro level of, I mean, I make the Jar Jar Binks joke kind of in passing, but is Jar Jar Binks accepted into the canon ultimately? Not in the same way that it seems Baby Yoda was accepted, immediately. So there can be shifts within canon itself on what the reception history dictates, but that the fandom can be different from what the experts claim is going on. And then the fandom is broken down in an interesting way, in our case, in a way that I can't really meaningfully retrieve in the ancient world for a variety of reasons, between, say, like children and adults, or adults who were children when these stories came out and the narratives meant something else to them at that point that changes over time. But what's shared there is the flexibility of these narratives, of the storytelling, and the meaning that people make out of it. That traverses generations, which continues to allow to perpetuate. And so then that reception history becomes important in terms of what practices revolve around it. So whether we're talking about cosplay, or people claiming that they're Jedi, or discourse about what's accepted and rejected in terms of the product being continually produced, all of that adds a whole new layer to this. And so to me, it's just too messy still right now for me to figure out.
Totally. And there's this convergence where the prequels were still George Lucas, but then we get to the sequels and we get to the TV shows, and these are people who were fans of the show, like of the original trilogy. And so that space between fandom and creator converges, and that already happened a little bit with the novels and some of the other.
And yeah, absolutely. And if I make the analogy again back to the ancient world, what that triggers for me is just because the text that we associate with the new canon, I mean, that was contested for many centuries. But just because certain texts made it into the canon does not mean the reception history was as robust as for other texts. So for example, I believe, and I would double check this, of course, so I'm kind of speaking extemporaneously because it's come up, but something like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, or the Acts of Paul, or something like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, or let's just say the Gospel of Thomas, that's a little bit more contested, but something like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, I believe we have more manuscript copies of that than other things, which suggests that the story of the little evil baby Jesus, who's like killing his playmates and like learning how to control his temper and, doing all kinds of naughty things all over. Joseph is like trying to reprimand him and he's doing the "you're not my real dad" speech. All of that. People enjoyed that. People enjoyed the story of Thecla. Thecla doesn't make it into the New Testament. The baby Jesus in the canon is a very different baby Jesus than the one who's upset because he's getting framed for an accident that looks like one of his it has all the markings of one of his typical temper tantrum murders, right? So the infancy gospel of Thomas, here's something that people loved, so reception history, but doesn't necessarily make a canon. So yes, there are even I know there were the cartoon, there was a Saturday morning cartoon for a long time that I think a lot of the makers now of it's essentially what we might call fan fiction. Some of that will meddle out and some of it may become part of canon, some of it won't.
Totally. I'm thinking of there was the like Ewok specials, cartoons.
Oh, the Christmas special. The Christmas special, not part of canon. Does anybody remember the Christmas special? Does anybody? Brian? Yep. Carlos, the Christmas
Happy
special.
Life Day.
Life Day. That is, yep, Seth.
But it's canon now because of the Lego version of it.
See? This is why we need to talk about this. But I think we all need to, when we talk about canon, we all just need to like pause for a moment and think about the Christmas special. Which has all the markings of canon, time-wise, characters, but yeah, right. We have to think about it. It is, yes, ritual, JBK. It's the ritual, like that thing has been basically expunged from the record, right? As much as possible. And so that's part of ritual too, right? We're not watching the Life Day special every year. We could be conceivably, but some of these things are blips on the screen. And so reception history becomes important there too, even it has all the other markers that it should be part of canon.
Yeah, and I have one more question and then we'll just open it up to anyone. And it's still relating to this theme because I think in the most recent trilogy kind of takes up the question of canon in how it tells the story. The two J.J. Abrams movies, and then the good one, that's my bias, the middle one, and I forget his name, the person who isn't J.J. Abrams. I'm not an expert on Star Wars, very clearly, but like they're playing with that question of how true to the story do we be, or do we critique the story, or have questions about the story, rethink how it might land in today's world. And I'm curious how that came up because that was another whereas I think there was generally a lot of acknowledging the shortcomings of the prequel trilogy. There were really wide approaches to the sequel trilogy and just how they play with this question of what is Star Wars, what does it mean to us now, to filmmakers, to audiences, etc.
The interesting thing about those films to me too is they had to make some interesting choices about how in the weeds are they going to get with some of the theorizations that fans have made about how things like the Force works. So I what you were talking about, I kept telling myself they're not thetans, it's not thetans, but there's something that they thought that depending how, thank you, how do you pronounce it? The
midichlorians.
right.
And they're worse than Jar Jar Binks.
They say, okay, this is what I'm talking. So some people are not down with it. And so ideas of like the dyad of power and like, there's so much, so like think about Rey, right? That lineage that they established for her basically mimicked a narrative structure that worked in the earlier films. Is that laziness? Is that to just create symmetry and narrative structure? You can have all of those debates that the midichlorians don't show up. I had a friend who just went to the Scientology building here in Clearwater, so that's why I have thetans on the mind, because she was telling me all about what that was like. That's a different story. But that the midichlorians don't really play in even quietly under the narrative structure Thetan's on the mind. Thank you, Max. That's an interesting choice too, right? And then there are politics that come into that film. I know a lot of people who were glad that there was a same-sex relationship depicted in the film, yet blink and you missed it, right? So there were these nods to contemporary politics, but they were also complex in their presentation. And that's about us. That's not about, so there's stuff feeding into that narrative that I think is again a beautiful analogy to how we should approach or think about all kinds of issues related to the study of religion. So it just happens to map very nicely onto early Christianity, but there are other ways that we can think about intersections of religion, politics, culture, and storytelling. And Thetans.
And Thetans. Great, thank you. I'll open it up now to folks, and also if there's stuff in the chat, I can scan through that. But if anyone has questions, Seth has a question.
Hi, Seth.
I'm off mute. Hey, thanks so much for being with us. I'm a longtime fan, first time caller to Arts Lunch. Thank you for setting this up, Max. My question is really about Demian's on. He's gonna like this. Reading Richard Rubinstein and his quest after the Holocaust for finding a unifying theology that goes beyond sort of Old Testament Judaism or conservative Orthodox Judaism. I've always watched Star Wars from that perspective of you have the Empire who is constantly in a mode of taking over the universe, and you have a rebellion that's in fluctuating modes of winning, losing, going on the run. How does everyone on the call, but how do you experts particularly see Star Wars playing a role in sort of post-apocalyptic, post-Holocaust modern religion and theology, rather than trying to look at it like I don't look at it like a unifying theory. I just can't. I mean, it's a movie, it's a lot of movies, but maybe it is a unifying theory for some. So just interested in your thoughts and comments about the empire being structured like Nazism, especially in the later, more recent movies with the giant banners and flags and the pageantry.
Well, I mean, I would want to make sure that I defer to some of the rest of you if you feel you have expertise in this area, because I don't want to pretend that I'm a spokesperson for this issue. I do see the analogies to empire very clearly. And so at bare minimum, I would hope that the transparency of that analogy helps people recognize that the legacy of something like the Second World War and the Holocaust and all the political trappings of that as well that led to the atrocities are not that distant. And so if you can embrace this narrative and it helps you understand the way that those things can develop in terms of political power that can come into, or the way the politics can shape power so that those things are possible, that it might help understand other human rights violations, period. I mean, there are other ones depicted in the film as well, including what was revealed in the most recent trilogy in terms of the stormtroopers are, these children who are basically war captives who are, forced into this like child labor essentially as well. So there are issues of social justice that can also come up that if no, I mean, I not to default to pedagogy again, but I do know that there are generations coming up that are not as well versed or knowledgeable about how something like the Holocaust was possible. And so if they can see those analogies, JBK, let me.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Max said, "Why don't I jump in?" I actually, a friend of mine designed a curriculum for Jewish, for a Hebrew school, based on the ethical questions raised by Star Wars, particularly the Death Star killing an entire planet. I seem to remember that was part of it. But there's definitely a way in which Jewish pedagogues were deliberately adopting the Star Wars. I mean, a lot for the same reasons that you're adopting it for pedagogy, but yet because the themes dealt with like killing, with genocides, and that it's hard not to use it. But then again, it's like, it's also hard, you know, when I think about it, I teach a Holocaust class. I don't think I would use that curriculum. It doesn't, it just, the Star Wars made genocide seem too easy. I mean, too.
Yeah, at the end, when we're supposed to sympathize with Adam Driver, I mean, he was committing horrible atrocities and genocide, and now we're supposed to like root for him to get the girl, like in the last, right? So you know, that to me, it's messy. I think the symbolism is there, and it opens up that conversation, like you're saying. To say politically, how are these things possible? You know, structurally, how are these social justice issues depicted in this narrative? And again, you're not going to have something, given our social cultural situatedness, the easiest thing to do when you want, we're not gonna, listen, you could put the American flag to indicate empire if you wanted to, right? That's not the imagery you're gonna get in that film. We're gonna go back to World War II. But you know, we're committing atrocities as an empire as well. And that's not to diminish, I'm not trying to diminish, but I'm just saying in terms of imagery, that is the symbolic well from which these filmmakers draw, which is also something that happens in filmmaking. There's a reason why biblical film was often put in the silent picture era on the screen versus other kinds of narrative, because depending on the symbol, you can indicate who a character was through dress, through symbols, and through a visual medium. And you can also do that. We continue to do that in filmmaking. And so the visual medium of those films allows for that analogy. And then the narrative structure, of course, as well. And those choices are interesting to mine, and they do make them useful for those conversations.
And then you get to, I mean, thinking of the prequels and some of the later, there's an attempt to question empire in a more explicit way. I mean, for all the hokiness of the prequels, there's some exploration of how does a republic, how does, you know, become an empire. I think of the Clone Wars series, animated series, the later one, and just like how it, for me, it kind of almost redeems the prequel series because there's like writing and thought that went into it, and it explores these questions of, do the Jedi radicalize themselves? So is that a form of extremism too? That's a thing that the show will ask, and it can do that in this longer, you know, form than a movie, but also just how does the empire, and how does the government structure, and how does business, and how do these things that are in that place, not just referencing Rome, but really referencing the US as well, how does that fit into it? So I think that some of the folks, maybe not George Lucas, but even a little bit George Lucas with some of the prequel stuff, are looking at the structures in our society later on. And it's interesting to see, you know, the different time periods, like when the movies are being made, when the shows
and you can detect shifts, you know, now that I think of it. I mentioned before the genre of the spaghetti western in space. My impression is in the latest movies, space is sort of incidental. They're just kind of, you know, on one landscape to another landscape, and the landscapes, I mean, I felt like some of the landscapes where the indigenous people were having their, you know, like celebration, and they sort of insert themselves so they can go in costume and be incognito. I mean, that tired cliche presentation. That's also part of movie making, obviously, that we've seen time and again. But the idea of space wasn't about a space battle anymore. It was about how do we go to those kinds of vistas and hit on those tropes from place to place, and then play out the drama in a different way. So that to me is that shift from that post, you know, interest in the space program. Like the space program is effectively, I mean, done as we know it. I mean, Elon Musk is, you know, trying to go to Mars, and we've got a rover up there. I understand that, but you know, it's not the same kind of drama that was on your television when we're landing on, you know, with Apollo, right? So that's no longer present of mind in the same way. So issues of empire do seem to be more important in those more recent movies, and it's not just about World War II, it's about us. How effectively that is explored in those movies is up for debate. But I do think, I just saw that Carlos asked the question about, how is the saga influencing contemporary society and narratives? I don't know how much it's influencing it, but I do see the influence of it. And these are the things that I do think it's a good exercise for us to explore, not just in terms of theory of the study of religion, but also just for self-reflection. It's a mirror of us. That we can look at and think about how do these narratives change our own perspective on our own actions, or at least lessons. I mean, that's what these narratives are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to be, they are lessons for ourselves. They're foils for us to think about our own action and the repetition of history. That's how they function. So I would be interested to hear what all of you think about how the saga is influencing contemporary society and narratives, but I do see it as a filter of contemporary society and narrative.
Yeah, are there other questions or responses to that? I mean, thinking, oh, Brian, yep.
I guess this might bridge the one that was just asked, but I guess a general question going back to looking at Star Wars as a religion. We also have, I don't know if you discussed this in your class at all, what about the elevation of the performers themselves? For example, my favorite one is what?
Mark Hamill.
Actually, I was gonna say, Carrie Fisher, because her character's arc, princess, senator, general, saint, is very much merged of her of Carrie Fisher. I mean, there are altar candles with it's Princess Leia, but it's actually Carrie as space mom. Take your pills, do your self-care, live to flip the universe off another day. She is an icon, and she has become an icon even more so after her passing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we tend to do that, don't we? In general, I mean, she even had a bodily ascension, in that last film. Now, of course, they didn't really have much of a choice. There's something interesting there that is a little bit of a different question, but one I think we will have to contend with, which is AI and its intersection with religion, because she was not in that last movie. She was in it, but she was not in it. They were able to CGI stuff off the cutting room floor, and actually her daughter was her stand-in, and the scene in the woods where she's training with Luke, the flashback, that was actually also from some of the fan fiction novel material that was excluded from the canon previously. So they gave a nod to some of the original intentions of the narrative post the original trilogy. But in that scene, her daughter stood in for her, and they CGI'd her face from the original trilogy, Carrie Fisher's face, onto her Billy Lord's face to do that scene. And this was not new, by the way, because Laurence Olivier appeared in what was that? I almost said Master and Commander, but that's not it.
Captain and the World of Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, right.
Yeah.
So Laurence Olivier was able to make an appearance. We're getting there, right? We're going to bring back James Dean. We're going to bring back Elizabeth Taylor. We can bring back Laurence Olivier. We can bring back whoever into these films. And so that's a different thing, because I also teach a death class. I teach a death and dying class where there are ethical debates about that. And there are debates about art and that, about performance theory. So that's a really thorny issue, but I do take your point that there's a certain parallelism with the way that she, especially in her passing, is able to be heralded as an avatar for all kinds of like space mom. Now, of course, I don't like space mom. I'd rather she's something a little bit more interesting than space mom, but that's okay. But that in itself is an avatar, right? So there is a way that in her passing, she becomes sufficiently flexible as a figure that you can put all kinds of symbolism and meaning, that actually sort of the vanilla treatment of her in the most recent trilogy, where she is just sort of this leader, but that was perfunctory. That was because she couldn't do the performance. They were cobbling this together, but there's all kinds of issues, I think, there that can be untangled, and this could be a marker of future action. There might not be so much significance for it in the sense that she sadly passed away, and so they had to do what they had to do to complete her story. But in the history of filmmaking and its implications for artistic performance, for ethics, for AI, that can be another moment. But I don't know what the people who say that they are Jedi, and the reason I put it that way is because it seems ill-defined to me as a religion by the standards with which we tend to define religion. And there's an issue there between how people self-identify and how scholars observe and describe that kind of practice. So there's an issue, I raise it in the article about, do we take the testimony of our objects of study for face value? And if they say we're Jedi, we say, okay, you're Jedi. Or do we look at what are your practices? What are your doctrines? Like, how do we define religion, and what features must a religion have to call it a religion? And then does Jediism map onto that? I don't know if Leia and or Carrie Fisher has been elevated within the circles of the Jedi world, or those claiming some religious affiliation with Jediism, into an hallowed figure. On the other hand, for the holidays, there's an artist who creates Byzantine icons of Carrie Fisher, of Admiral Akbar, of Yoda, of all the, and I bought my husband a Yoda icon. So I'm pretty sure you can get a Carrie Fisher Leia prayer candle if you want, and that will be dug up in 2,000 years and will confuse the hell out of people.
I think this relates to the question that Caroline asked here, and Carlos agreed. Could we say that it's less of a religion and more of the birth of a new mythology around which a religion could develop but isn't inherent in it?
Yeah, the short answer is I think it has a chance. I mentioned I mentioned in passing, or I do in the article, I do an exercise with my students that it's 40, 21. And, there was some big event that we were all driven, underground. Like, this is a little more sensitive now that we've had a pandemic, but we were all driven, into our into isolation. And, I usually say underground because I want to create the material culture connection, so that, like, we're going to have to look at the archaeology of 2021 to figure out what happened to these people, the way that we do for the Greco-Roman world. And so I create some whole narrative about how, while they find Disney World and Disneyland, and then they find in domestic structure these votive offerings to this anthropomorphic mouse. So there must have been, a religion that venerated the anthropomorphic mouse Mickey and his consort Minnie, and then these other animals, anthropomorphic animals. Like, you see where I'm going with that. I think that, there's a mythology around Star Wars that's even more stark, that certainly has those features. And again, people claiming already that they're Jedi. An analogy my students drew to my attention that needs more attention on my part is Scientology. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done to thinking through this, but I think it has a chance. Bob had a question before.
Yeah, it strikes me, there's an elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned, which is, I was a postdoc when the first movie came out and went to it. And it seemed to me then, still seems to me now, that the point of these movies is not to start a religion, but is to make a buck.
Yeah.
And that's the point of all the novels and the cartoons that we're seeing today, right? That is, no matter how nice these people are, the point is to make a buck. And how does that tie into then, drawing a parallel with religion?
I know. I mentioned it in passing earlier because I'm a little bit, Brian saying it's exactly the same. It's an uncomfortable, because you don't want to, this is when I use, I hide behind the phrase social capital. I'm using Pierre Bourdieu when I do that and French theorists. And I also like to think about like Veblen goods. Like I tried to hide behind theory to think about these issues. But the idea of social capital, it is multivalent. So we don't have to take so much of a cynical perspective, because it is also still art. And it was certainly innovative. And the first movie was an innovation. It was an innovation in form, genre filmmaking. What happened is that it was aesthetically and commercially successful. That doesn't always happen, but it can happen. And so when that does, it's hard to get out of that orbit. and to not see it through that lens. And once you see it, it creates a challenge for reception, because once you realize you're being used, right, it's hard to unsee it. And then when you see the narratives, when you start to untangle the narratives, you're always at risk of destroying the thing that you love, which is another risk in all of this, the thing that has meaning making for you. But the example that stands out in my mind is that my husband pointed out to me once that Ghostbusters is a movie about capitalism and like Reaganomics, and like, because this small business, you know, against all odds, like upstart company, like is trying to control like the supernatural. Like once he pointed out to me that that was just a movie about capitalism, like I was like, oh man. You know, I just loved Ghostbusters, right? So once you start to see that, yeah, unregulated nuclear reactor, exactly, the EPA comes in, you know, but they don't need that government regulation, right? So everything, and you know, I'm just like, oh, Bill Murray, right? Like we don't want to think about those things, but we have to keep in mind that this is all part of practice and ritual as well. We give them our money, and it has certain significance and ritual structure, but it also tells us that this is one of the features that we can point to for religious organization and durability.
And something that I'm thinking of in relation to that question is also, though, the people who got a lot of crap for being in these movies later, you know, for not being white men. So there's definitely money, but there's also a risk that happened, or for a whole movie to be considered terrible by the fans, and sort of there's the money, but then there's also this question of how much do we listen to the hardcore fans, how much do we listen to the general public. So it seems like there's other things at stake. I don't know if you'd agree, Robyn.
I've thought a lot about this in terms of the actors sometimes. Sometimes an actor just does so well in a role, the mythology around a character or a role becomes so embedded in cultural imagination that they can't get out. I know Mark Hamill did other things, but Mark Hamill is Luke Skywalker, right? And he never really, Carrie Fisher was able to break out, you know, she was in Hannah and Her Sisters, you know, she was able to do some other roles, but you know, she was also a little bit hiding behind the costume. I know it wasn't like, you know, major costume, but you know, she could be a chameleon in terms of her character acting in a way that I don't think Mark Hamill was able to do because he was so strongly associated. And there are a number of, I mean, when I'm saying this now, I can imagine some of you are running through the Rolodex in your mind of other actors who were never quite able to break out. You know, I wonder what Daisy Ridley will do. Is she too strongly associated with the role of Rey or not? Someone like Adam Driver was already well established in being a character actor. I think I make the joke in that piece that I was upset at the first movie. I called it Girls in Space. I mean, most people knew Adam Driver from the TV show Girls. And he was a little bit petulant, I felt, in his characterization in those films in a way that reminded me of the TV show he was already on. So some of these actors don't become subject to that, but some do. And so that's another interesting question as well. When our own mythology casts somebody in a way that they can't break out. And that relates to canon, by the way, because, you know, there are certain things that, you know, your Jesus just can't do. And there are certain ways he also can't be depicted in iconography. And I only go to Jesus because of my expertise, but, you know, Jesus is going to generally be depicted as a, you know, jacked white guy in our iconography. And when you deviate from that and take the beard away, people are, you know, angry and confused. So that's another whole conversation, but it's one that we need to have when we think about what we authorize, because all art, there is some element of reception. There is, of course, the artist, but the reception, you know, some would argue is just as important. And so to meet those cultural expectations creates this dynamic that we have to be attentive to. And so there's certain iconography, again, certain imagery, certain narrative that will not be accepted, and that becomes sort of self-fulfilling, including the actor themselves.
So thinking about
Flash Gordon.
Oh yeah.
You're right. I forgot about that. Oh wait, there's more. Sorry. Go ahead, Matt. I'm just catching up on
yeah, there's a lot of chat.
Lego. Yeah, Lego. We definitely need to talk about Lego.
So, you know, what is the religion as a class that Demian teaches here at United, and this question of how we engage religion, what's canon, comes up in as seminarians, and I'm curious what other folks from United would maybe say. How would Star Wars be a potential tool in ministry or in chaplaincy or in theological work?
Let's have our own synod. What do you have? What's that word about? We could determine our own canon here.
Exactly. So I'm curious what folks here might say. How might you use Star Wars in your work? And just feel free to jump in.
In general, I just use Star Wars from the storytelling point of view. You know, the power of story and narrative. As far as taking up specific lessons, I haven't been looking at Star Wars specifically too much lately, only because I watch Star Trek so much that I'm mining it right now for examples of chaplaincy and spiritual care and working with others. Probably when I'm done, I'll probably go through Star Wars, Battlestar, and I'm basically trying to like go through a whole bunch of pop culture and mining it for chaplaincy roles.
Demian, not to call on you, but I'm going to call on you. See how this conversation might speak to your work with what is religion, if you're there.
You got caught flat-footed on that one in terms of.
Well, what about you, Jennifer? Curious.
Well, I'm appreciating this conversation because I'm teaching historical theology this summer, you know, in a week. And so it's always, I think, I can see how it's a helpful example, like what you were, you know, describing at the beginning of the session, to get folks who, you know, to maybe think about what the stakes are for people. I think that's often one of the difficult things, is that people think like, well, why does everybody need to agree on everything? What's so important about having a creed or like things like this? And so to try and like use contemporary examples as a way to help students kind of imagine or to be sympathetic with what the motivations are for the historical figures that we're talking about, even if you can't identify maybe with their, you know, context. Like, why didn't they just smash the patriarchy? It's like, well, you know, because the patriarchy would have killed them. You know? But, you know, so I think it's, I've enjoyed, you know, hearing your reflections, and I'm sure it will inform a little bit of my teaching in these first few weeks of the semester. I was actually curious as you were talking, and this is maybe not such a fun question for most people here, but I was wondering what kind of assignments you do in that class, in your Star Wars class. But we could also just maybe connect offline and talk about these more like the nitty gritty of the pedagogical things.
I do a lot of drawing in class, actually. So depending on, so thinking about what's the force and comparing it to Stoicism, for example, I might give them primary sources on, you know, Greco-Roman philosophy. And then that's why, I like to use their pre-knowledge. So I use that in two ways. One is if they know a lot about Star Wars, they can come in and, you know, tell me about the midichlorians, and like, the buy-in is there, the investment is there. So to draw the analogies to, say, Stoicism, they get really excited about that. And so I ask them to draw the cosmology on the board. sometimes, just make it concrete. I like that they have to, it becomes a malleable thing, and literally that they can work that kind of thing into their repertoire of ways to articulate themselves or to communicate. So that's something I like to do. We could talk about other specific assignments. I had them bring in memes and pick apart the cultural significance of the meme. Why is it funny? Humor is always a very, very difficult thing to theorize with specificity, and so that I found to be a really useful exercise as well. So there are a few others like that I can tell you more about. Yeah, Max uses memes too. Yeah, especially I think because it was last spring, the first assignment was just why Baby Yoda was taking off the way that it was. At that point, we didn't know Baby Yoda's name, but there were some people they loved Baby Yoda. And to me, it was that intersection again, when I was saying before, I like to think about the intersections of theory, culture, religion, politics, but also genre and all of that. There was something about just the simplistic brilliance of bye Melissa, of an infant Yoda, the cuteness, but also in terms of et cetera, right? Like there was so much to, like, why nobody had a Baby Yoda before this was just, mind-boggling once you saw it. But, why did Baby Yoda work now? Like, what did we need as a people that, like, we needed a Baby Yoda to save us from the political administration and a pandemic, and we could all talk about Baby Yoda and it made us happy, and make memes. And I still follow Baby Yoda. They're still going every day. I have, like, what was the chicky nuggies and chocolate milk, like, like the baby speak you could get. Yep, I think so. Yes, Baby Yoda, Baby Jesus. I think so. It's about the same amount of time between infancy, gospel, and Thomas, and when we think the gospels were. But yeah, there was something about that in its cultural moment that it's interesting to explore. But again, it gives students that chance to be like, it's hard, but they have to debate. Like, they bring in their meme, they own it, so like, now you have to tell me why this thing is funny, like, why the heck chicky nuggies, and explain it to me. And so that makes for an interesting class, an interesting exercise.
So thank you so much, Robyn. We're at time. If there's any final thing you want to say, or we can applaud.
No, I like that I ended this talk by banging on a desk screaming chicky nuggies. I think that's a sign that I'm done.
I just wanted to throw in a really big thanks, because in the interreligious chaplaincy program, I think this stuff is so important, because so many people, walking into a room, I think that's one of the important questions, is to find out what religion they are, and to kind of get some clues about, that connection. And so if someone's got like a Green Bay Packer pennant above their bed, or they have Star Wars pictures, it's good to really hear this stuff, because we can get so focused on one thing. And I know a friend of mine a long time said his religion was the Minnesota Orchestra, and I could never, I just said, oh, okay. But I just like that, that's always stuck with me for many years. And now I'm getting it that, yeah, there's many forms of religion. And then when you really, like you're saying, is when you look really close, there's not a lot of difference. And then you can even go into the canons and all that. And it's interesting. What I walk away with this too, is getting a better idea of what canon is. Like,
yeah, I teach a religion and sports class, and it's the same thing. People will tell me football, and we have sports teams here at UM, like the football team, that are very important to people. I myself, grew up a big fan of baseball. And so there's rivalry, there's, you're praying to some kind of supernatural force when, like, you want a home run. And think about the athletes themselves, they cross home base, and they, have all their ritual as well. And so the way I describe that sometimes is that, imagine a Venn diagram, you know, because you do have some of those elements, there's supernatural, but there's not, you know, there's rules. There are all kinds of, it's a very fruitful discussion. And I may not, as a scholar of religion, think that baseball is a religion or that Star Wars is a religion yet, bracket. But there are all kinds of issues of ritual, of doctrine, of practice, of discourse, of, you know, all of this figureheads that you can discuss fruitfully to just challenge yourself. And again, it's always a mirror, I think, when we're talking about contemporary issues on ourselves, and that kind of self-reflection is important.
Great. Well, let's do a round of applause. Thank you so much, Robyn, for being a guest at Arts Lunch. Next week, we will be doing a hands-on intro to Jewish paper cutting. So bring paper. I recommend origami, but any sort of colorful paper, scissors, anyone's welcome. You don't have to be good at it. It's just learning a little bit about the history, doing some work with our hands, shaking it up a little bit. And yeah, everyone's always welcome to Arts Lunch every Tuesday at the same time, same Zoom link. And if you're ever interested in presenting on a topic, we're always open to discuss. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me, everyone. This was really a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. And, you know, I would love to join you guys again. So thank you so much.
Yay.